For centuries, sheriffs in Salem feared a curse. Sudden illnesses, unexplained deaths, mysterious misfortunes. One by one, the men tasked with keeping order in the town fell to strange fates. The curse, the whispers said, belonged to a man crushed beneath heavy stones, a man who, with his final breath, refused to bend to the law of Salem. He uttered two chilling words, "More weight." That man was Giles Corey, and his death would haunt Salem long after the last rope swung on Gallows Hill. But to understand the curse, to understand the shadows that linger, we must go back to the winter of 1692, to a small Puritan village gripped by fear, superstition, and a faith so rigid it left no room for doubt. Salem Village was a place of hardship. Winters were bitter, crops were unreliable, and disease claimed lives with cruel swiftness. Every neighbor relied on one another, yet every slight, every whisper, every unexplained misfortune could ignite suspicion. The Puritans believed the devil walked among them, ever eager to corrupt the faithful, and they were right to fear, or so they thought. It began in the home of Reverend Samuel Parris. His daughter Betty, barely 10, and his niece Abigail, just 11, began to convulse in strange fits. They screamed, thrashed, and collapsed in ways that no physician could explain. Their eyes rolled back, their bodies twisted, their voices cried out words that made grown men shiver. The village watched in terror. Some thought sickness, others thought of demonic possession. And when the girls began naming names, neighbors and servants who they claimed tormented them under the devil's influence, Salem's fragile peace was shattered. The first accused were women on the margins. Tituba, an enslaved woman from the Caribbean, whose knowledge of folk tales and charms made her a convenient scapegoat. Sarah Good, a beggar woman, muttering curses to passers-by. And Sarah Osborne, an older woman who rarely attended church. Each accusation was a spark, each spark threatening to set the village ablaze. As arrests were made, fear spread faster than the winter cold. Families whispered in hallways, neighbors glanced with suspicion, and the church became both courtroom and confessional. To doubt the girls was to invite suspicion. The devil, they believed, could influence the mind and heart of anyone, and perhaps even you. The Court of Oyer and Terminer was formed to handle the growing flood of accusations. Judges, convinced of the devil's reach, allowed spectral evidence, visions and dreams, as proof of guilt. The cries of the afflicted girls, the trembling of their bodies, and the pointing of their fingers became law. No one was safe, and every denial only strengthened the court's certainty of Satan's work. By midsummer, Salem's prisons were overflowing. Men, women, and even children were shackled and held in dark, damp cells. Children huddled in corners, clutching one another, while parents prayed desperately, knowing that a single accusation could cost them their lives. Daily life collapsed. Crops went untended, families starved, fields lay fallow while fear consumed the village, and the accusers grew bolder. Abigail Williams, Ann Putnam Jr., and Mercy Lewis. They convulsed, screamed, and claimed to see the spirits of those who tormented them. A neighbor's glance, a whispered word, an old grudge could become evidence of witchcraft. Every household became a battlefield of suspicion. Even the most respected members of the community were not safe. Rebecca Nurse, a grandmother known for her piety, Martha Corey, a woman of sharp mind and strong faith, and ministers of the village, once the moral compass of Salem, found themselves dragged before the court. If the devil could touch them, who could be trusted? The gallows were raised. The first executions, Sarah Good and Tituba among them, set a grim precedent. The crowd gathered, faces pale, hearts racing, as the accused climbed the ladder. Their prayers echoed in the cold air. The ropes snapped, and the bodies swayed, a chilling reminder of what fear had wrought. Yet even in the midst of terror, the shadows of Salem seemed to whisper of something darker still. Giles Corey's death would come soon, his curse stretching centuries into the future. Whispers of haunted houses, restless spirits, and strange misfortunes began to circulate. The past and the present were entwined, as though Salem itself refused to forget. The story of Salem is not just a story of witches. It is a story of fear, of human weakness, of how suspicion and superstition can destroy lives. And it is a story that continues to echo, to haunt, and to warn. As the winter of 1692 gave way to spring, fear in Salem grew like wildfire. The first accusations had sparked terror, and now the fire spread to every home, every family, every whispered thought. The girls who had fallen into convulsions became instruments of the devil in the eyes of the townspeople, and their voices were law. One word, one gesture, one tremor in the courtroom could condemn a neighbor to death. Neighbors who had once exchanged pleasantries now turned cold. Old grudges, jealousies, and rivalries became fuel for accusation. A farmer who coveted his neighbor's land might find the neighbor's wife suddenly under suspicion. A mother who scolded a child too harshly could be accused of tormenting spirits. Fear made monsters of ordinary people. The Court of Oyer and Terminer, established to deal with the growing tide of allegations, became both a theater of horror and an instrument of unquestioned authority. Judges Samuel Sewall, William Stoughton, and others leaned over the accused, their faces etched with solemnity, convinced they were defending God's law. The courtroom echoed with the shrieks of the afflicted girls, Abigail, Anne, Mercy, whose voices climbed and fell like a chorus of the damned. Evidence was spectral, unseen, intangible, yet damning. The girls claimed to see spirits of the accused tormenting them. They described invisible claws, black shapes, and voices from the dark. The judges accepted these visions as truth. Deny them, and the court believed Satan had taken residence in your soul. Confess, and your life might be spared, but your honor was forever lost. One by one, Salem's citizens were drawn into the hysteria. Rebecca Nurse, a grandmother admired for her piety and kindness, found herself accused after a dispute over land and a neighbor's envy. Martha Corey, sharp-tongued and fearless in her convictions, was named next. Even ministers were not immune. Reverend George Burroughs, once a respected leader, found himself dragged to court, accused of attending witches' Sabbaths and invoking the devil. The prisons swelled. Families huddled together in damp, dark cells, children crying quietly in corners. Parents prayed, begged, and wept. Every sound, a cough, a creak in the floor, a whispered name, became evidence, became proof that the devil was at work in their midst. The accused faced impossible choices. Some confessed to acts they had never committed, flying through the air on broomsticks, signing Satan's book, or cavorting with demons. Because confessing, no matter how false, was life itself. Others refused, and for those who refused, the gallows waited. Giles Corey, already a stubborn figure in the village, remained silent when accused. He would endure a fate so cruel it would echo through the centuries, pressed beneath stones, refusing to answer. His final words forever etched in history. More wait. His defiance became a legend, a shadow stretching over Salem long after the last trials ended. Even as the accused were condemned, rumors began to circulate of strange occurrences. At night, shadows moved in abandoned fields. Whispers were heard in empty halls. Some claimed that those who had been executed left a residue of anger, of injustice, that clung to the village. Gallows Hill itself seemed to thrum with life long after the ropes had been lowered. By summer, the town was a battlefield of suspicion. Friends no longer trusted friends. Families were torn apart. Mothers whispered warnings to their children. Do not speak to strangers. Do not answer their questions. And never, ever be alone. The hysteria fed on itself. The more people feared, the more they accused, and the more the accused suffered. The Court of Oyer and Terminer grew bolder, more unyielding. Even the most respected citizens could not protect themselves. Denial was meaningless. Confession was tainted, and the gallows awaited like a patient predator, its shadow long and unrelenting. Through it all, the specter of Giles Corey's curse lingered. Even the town leaders began to whisper in fear that the devil was not only in the accused, but in the machinery of Salem itself. Every execution, every shivering confession, every child's cry seemed to feed the darkness that had taken hold. By the end of that first wave, dozens were imprisoned, and the number of those condemned to die had already begun to climb. And yet, for all the horror, the villagers believed they were protecting their souls. They were blind to the truth. That fear, not God, was ruling Salem. By midsummer of 1692, Salem had become a village consumed by fear. The jails overflowed with the accused, their chains clinking in the damp darkness. Families huddled together in cramped cells, children crying silently in corners, wondering if their parents would return. Every knock at the door, every whispered name, every glance could be fatal. The court of Oyer and Terminer was relentless. Judges leaned over the accused with unwavering certainty, interpreting every denial as proof of Satan's influence. Spectral evidence, visions, dreams, and invisible torment was accepted as law. If the girls claimed that a spirit of your neighbor had harmed them, it was enough to condemn you. If you protested, your refusal was seen as resistance to God's will. The gallows loomed over the village like a silent predator. 19 people would eventually be hanged, one pressed to death, and hundreds imprisoned. Yet even as the ropes creaked and the crowd gathered, whispers of something darker began to circulate. Shadows were said to flicker across Gallows Hill at night. Strange cries were heard in the woods, and the memory of Giles Corey's curse lingered like smoke, warning that justice in Salem had become perverse. The first executions were both shocking and strangely routine. Sarah Good, a poor beggar, was hanged for witchcraft. Tituba, the enslaved woman whose knowledge of folk stories had made her suspect, followed. The crowd watched, silent and fearful, as the ropes tightened and the bodies swayed. For many, the thrill of fear was intoxicating, a grim spectacle that reminded them of the power of the court. John Proctor, a farmer respected for his honesty and integrity, became one of the most notable victims. He had spoken out against the hysteria, warning that the girls' fits were not divine but a dangerous performance. Yet when his wife Elizabeth was accused, he found himself ensnared in the same web. Proctor refused to confess to acts he had not committed. On the day of his execution, he climbed the ladder with dignity, his final prayer cut short by the snap of the rope. His courage inspired others but could not stop the tide of death. Rebecca Nurse, Martha Corey, and Reverend George Burroughs followed. Burroughs, a minister, stunned the crowd when he flawlessly recited the Lord's Prayer just moments before his execution, a feat that, according to Puritan belief, witches could not achieve. The judges ignored the murmurs of doubt and pressed on. Burroughs swung from the rope, a tragic symbol of reason crushed under hysteria. Even children were not spared. 4-year-old Dorothy Good, daughter of Sarah Good, languished in prison, starving, trembling, suffering for the sins of her mother. The very innocence of Salem was being devoured by its own fear. Yet amid this carnage, doubt began to surface. How could a minister, a grandmother, a child be in league with the devil? How could God allow such injustice? Even some judges and ministers whispered in secret, uneasy about the path the village had taken. And still, the accusations continued. Abigail Williams, Ann Putnam Jr., and the other afflicted girls grew bolder. Each convulsion, each dramatic fit, each shriek became another weapon, another chance to point at someone, and every name brought another life closer to death. Giles Corey's story haunted the village as the executions unfolded. His crushing death, his defiance, and his curse became a shadow that stretched across Gallows Hill. Many believed the devil himself lingered, feeding on the fear, binding Salem tighter in terror. By the end of this summer, the village had changed forever. The gallows had claimed 20 lives. Families were shattered. The air was thick with suspicion, grief, and unspoken dread. Salem was no longer a village of faith. It was a town where fear ruled, where suspicion killed, and where the past refused to die. By late summer, Salem was exhausted. The prisons were overflowing. The gallows had claimed too many lives. Families had been torn apart, fields left untended, homes abandoned. And yet, fear still lingered in the village like a stubborn fog. But cracks were beginning to appear in the hysteria. The stories no longer fully aligned. Ministers, once unwavering in their support of the court, began to question the evidence. How could a minister like George Burroughs recite the Lord's Prayer flawlessly if he had been in league with the devil? How could a grandmother like Rebecca Nurse, known for her kindness and piety, be guilty? Even the afflicted girls began to falter. Some confessed privately that their fits were exaggerated, that their accusations were born of fear, jealousy, or attention. They had tasted power in a village that had previously ignored them, and the consequences of their actions now weighed heavily on them. Governor William Phips returned from Massachusetts' frontier, finding Salem in chaos. Prisoners filled the jails. Executions had shocked the colony. Even his own household was touched by suspicion. The hysteria had spiraled out of control, and he knew something had to be done. The court of Oyer and Terminer was dissolved, replaced by a new court that no longer accepted spectral evidence. Without the visions, the courtroom crumbled. Accusers lost their power, and many accused were released. Families were reunited, though the scars of trauma ran deep. Some of the accusers came forward with confessions. Ann Putnam Jr., one of the most prominent girls whose testimony had sent neighbors to the gallows, admitted that her visions were not always real. She begged forgiveness, but the dead could not be returned. Other figures, like Reverend Samuel Parris, clung desperately to power, but were ultimately forced from their positions. Their authority, once absolute, was shattered. The village had begun to reckon with what they had done, yet the shadows remained. Gallows Hill, empty now, still seemed heavy with memory. Locals whispered of strange cries in the wind. Visitors in modern times have reported chills, a sense of being watched, and a feeling that the earth itself remembers the terror that once walked upon it. Families struggled to reclaim normal life. Apologies were made. Compensation was offered to the victims' families. Land and money could not undo the damage. Grief, shame, and regret lingered like a dark cloud over Salem. Even as the courts faltered and confessions surfaced, the story of Salem began to transform. What had been a place of hysteria became a cautionary tale. The villagers who survived would spend the rest of their lives haunted by their choices, aware that fear had driven them to acts they could never undo. And somewhere, lingering in the stories and the shadows, the echo of Giles Corey's defiance still whispered. His curse, or perhaps the moral weight of Salem itself, seemed to stretch across the years, reminding all who listened that hysteria leaves a mark that death cannot erase. Salem was slowly recovering, but it would never be the same. The village had learned a lesson carved in blood, sorrow, and fear. That fear unchecked becomes a monster, and suspicion left unchallenged becomes a weapon capable of destroying a community. By the fall of 1692, the village of Salem was quiet, but the silence was heavy. The screams, the chains, the snaps of ropes, all were gone. Yet the memory of what had happened hung over every street, every home, every family. The community was fractured beyond repair. Families mourned. Children grew up too quickly, their innocence stolen. Parents who had denounced their neighbors in fear now stared at empty chairs at their dinner tables. Friends who had accused friends walked in shame, avoiding one another's eyes, whispering apologies that could never bring back the dead. Some who had wielded accusation publicly began to confess in private. Ann Putnam Jr., whose testimony had sent so many to their deaths, admitted that much of what she claimed had been exaggerated or entirely false. She begged forgiveness, writing letters and seeking absolution. But the voices of the dead could not be silenced. Reverend Parris, once a pillar of authority, was forced from his home and stripped of influence. He lived the remainder of his life burdened by whispers of his role in the hysteria. The judges, too, faced shame, and some publicly repented for the part they had played in condemning the innocent. And yet Salem remained haunted. The gallows were empty, but Gallows Hill still whispered its dark history. Locals claimed that at dusk, shadows moved where no person stood. Strange cries echoed through the streets. Some said the spirits of those unjustly executed lingered, restless, their grief and rage seeping into the very soil of the town. Even the houses carried memory. The parsonage where Reverend Parris's family first became entangled in the hysteria is said to echo with strange sounds. Visitors who walk the halls in silence sometimes feel a cold presence, a whisper, or a sense that someone is watching. The past, it seems, cannot be buried. Giles Corey's curse loomed over all of it. His defiance in the face of injustice, refusing to plead, enduring the crushing stones, became legend. Sheriffs and officials in later centuries reported sudden illnesses and misfortunes, blaming Corey's spirit for lingering vengeance. To this day, locals speak of his ghost wandering the old jail and Gallows Hill, a reminder that some acts leave shadows that refuse to fade. Over time, Salem transformed. What had been a village of terror became a city that embraced its history. The memory of the trials evolved into museums, tours, and festivals. Every October, thousands gather to remember, to honor, and to reclaim the name Witch. Candlelit streets and historic homes tell the story to the living, a story meant to warn, to educate, and to haunt. Yet beneath the celebrations lies a persistent shadow. The lessons of Salem are not just in books or museum plaques. They linger in the wind over Gallows Hill, in the quiet corners of old homes, in the stories whispered from parent to child. Fear, suspicion, and unchecked hysteria can rise again, and Salem's past is a mirror, a cautionary reflection of what can happen when fear overtakes reason. The trials were over, but Salem was still learning. Families rebuilt, fields were tended, and life slowly returned to normal. Yet the echoes remained, and those echoes, the lingering spirits of injustice and grief, continue to draw the curious, the brave, and the haunted, reminding the world that some histories are never truly finished. Even centuries later, the shadow of Salem refuses to lift. The village, now a city, thrives with tourists and history enthusiasts, but beneath the cobblestone streets and quaint colonial homes, the memory of 1692 pulses like a heartbeat. Giles Corey's story remains the most enduring legend of all. The man who endured the press of stones, refusing to plead, whose last words were two chilling syllables, "More weight," became a symbol of defiance, justice, and the terrifying power of fear. Officials who once dismissed his story as legend whispered about strange illnesses and misfortunes among lawmen and magistrates who tried to maintain order in Salem's shadow. Some say his spirit roams the old jail, the courthouse, and Gallows Hill itself, a spectral witness to the injustices of his time. Gallows Hill, once the site of countless executions, still carries its dark energy. Locals report feeling cold breezes when the sun is high, hearing cries or footsteps in places where none should exist. Tourists have captured fleeting shadows in photographs, only to find them inexplicable when developed. The land remembers. The trees, the soil, even the wind seem to whisper warnings that the past is never fully gone. Salem's cultural memory is rich and complex. Museums and tours tell the story of fear, superstition, and tragedy, but they also remind visitors of resilience. Schools teach the trials as lessons in justice and human behavior. Yet, for those who walk alone at night through the city, it is impossible to ignore the lingering echoes, the restless spirits, the whispered warnings, and the faint sense of injustice that persists. The curse, whether real or metaphorical, acts as a moral compass. It reminds us that hysteria can destroy communities, that fear can twist faith into cruelty, and that power can become a weapon when unchecked. Giles Corey's defiance and the deaths on Gallows Hill are warnings etched into history, a testament to human endurance and to the darkness that can overtake us if reason is abandoned. Modern Salem has embraced both sides of its story, the tourist-friendly cobblestones and witch-themed shops, and the sober reflection on the cost of fear. Every October, crowds flock to the city, candles in hand, as they walk the streets that were once soaked with suspicion and blood. Guides recount tales of the trials, of Corey, of Nurse, of Proctor, all while reminding the audience that the past is never truly silent. And indeed it is not. Whispers of strange occurrences persist. Lights flicker in abandoned houses, shadows cross empty halls, and some claim to hear cries echoing across Gallows Hill on the anniversary of the first execution. Visitors report sudden chills, an inexplicable sense of being watched, and the haunting presence of those who died unjustly. The stories of 1692 have become both history and legend, a blend that blurs the line between fact and the supernatural. The legacy of Salem is not just in textbooks or historical reenactments. It is in the lessons it imparts, that fear left unchecked can consume a community, that superstition can turn neighbor against neighbor, and that courage, defiance, and integrity, even in the face of unimaginable horror, leave a mark far beyond a single lifetime. Giles Corey's 2 words, more weight, echo still, not merely as defiance against the law that crushed him, but as a warning. The weight of fear, the weight of accusation, the weight of injustice, these are forces that continue to shape our world. Salem teaches that these forces, if ignored, can rise again. And though the gallows are gone, the lessons remain, etched in the stones, the wind, and the restless shadows that refuse to be silenced. Salem endures as a city, as a memory, as a warning. The trials may be over, but the echoes, the ghosts, and the legacy of courage and terror persist. To walk in Salem is to walk in history, to feel the weight of its stories, and to remember that the past never truly dies. Salem is more than a story of witches and trials. It is a mirror reflecting the darkest corners of human nature. Fear, suspicion, and the desire for control can twist communities into arenas of cruelty. The villagers believed they were defending God's law, yet in doing so, they surrendered their reason to hysteria. The events of 1692 illustrate a chilling truth, that ordinary people, under pressure and fear, are capable of extraordinary harm. Friends turned on friends, neighbors accused neighbors, and families destroyed families. When fear dominates, logic becomes fragile, certainty replaces compassion, authority becomes absolute, and justice bends to the will of the frightened. Psychologists today might recognize the same mechanisms that drove Salem's hysteria: groupthink, confirmation bias, and the human tendency to find patterns where none exist. The girls' fits, once thought supernatural, were magnified by attention, fear, and social pressure. The townspeople's acceptance of spectral evidence was fueled not by reason, but by the human desire to assign blame, to find someone responsible for their unease. Yet amid the horror, there were moments of courage. Giles Corey's defiance under the press of stones symbolizes the strength of integrity and principle in the face of injustice. John Proctor's refusal to falsely confess reminds us that truth, even when it leads to death, can stand as a beacon across centuries. These acts of resistance became the moral compass of Salem's story, and their lessons echo long after the gallows have been dismantled. Salem also reminds us that history is never neutral. Stories are told, retold, and shaped by those who survive. In the retelling, we find warnings, reflections, and insights into our own nature. The ghosts of Salem are as much metaphors as they are legends, shadows of the consequences when fear goes unchecked, when suspicion becomes a weapon, and when society abandons empathy. Even today, the lessons of Salem are relevant. Fear of the unknown, the need to control, and the desire to assign blame exist in every generation. Modern communities, organizations, and even nations face their own trials of suspicion, rumor, and moral panic. Salem serves as both a cautionary tale and a call to awareness, vigilance against fear, mindfulness of justice, and courage to stand for truth. The town's haunted past also teaches the delicate balance between history and legend. The stories of spirits, curses, and strange happenings are not just for thrill seekers, they are expressions of the weight of unresolved trauma. Giles Corey's curse, the whispers of Gallows Hill, and the tales of haunted houses are reminders that the past continues to exert influence on the present. Memory, when marked by injustice, refuses to remain silent, and perhaps the most profound lesson of all is humility. Salem warns that no individual, no matter how respected or pious, is immune to the forces of fear and hysteria. Community is fragile, justice is delicate, and human nature is capable of both cruelty and courage in equal measure. To walk through Salem, to read its history, to listen to its whispers, is to confront these truths. The village teaches that while the past cannot be changed, understanding it can shape the present. And in understanding, perhaps, we find the tools to resist repeating the same horrors. Today, Salem is a city that thrives on its history. Tourists flood the streets, museums tell the stories of the trials, and gift shops proudly display witch-themed merchandise. Yet beneath the lively celebrations lies a town that remembers. The past is never fully buried, and its shadows persist in subtle, haunting ways. Gallows Hill, where 19 innocent people were hanged and Giles Corey pressed to death, remains a place of solemn reflection. Even in bright daylight, visitors report a chill in the air, a sudden feeling of unease, as though the land itself carries the memory of suffering. At night, the wind seems to whisper, carrying voices from centuries past. Some claim to see shadows moving where no one stands, fleeting glimpses of figures who were wronged, yet whose stories refuse to be forgotten. The parsonage where Reverend Parris lived, the old jail, and many of the colonial homes of Salem are said to be haunted. Lights flicker inexplicably. Cold spots appear in rooms. Visitors feel as though they are not alone, as though the ghosts of the accused linger, watching, judging, waiting. Even Giles Corey's legend lives on. Locals speak of his curse, a weight that endures, a reminder that injustice leaves a mark that time cannot erase. Officials, historians, and residents alike whisper about strange occurrences, misfortunes, or sudden illness, attributing them to Corey's defiance, to the spirits of the wronged, or to the lingering moral weight of Salem itself. The fascination with Salem is more than historical curiosity. It is a human attempt to understand fear, injustice, and the consequences of hysteria. Visitors walk the cobblestone streets not merely to see museums or reenactments, but to feel the presence of the past, to confront the weight of what occurred, and perhaps to reflect on the ways human nature can be both courageous and cruel. Every year, during October, thousands gather to commemorate, to explore, to celebrate, and to remember. Candlelit tours retrace the paths of the accused. Actors bring the stories of Proctor, Nurse, and Corey to life. But even amidst the festivities, a subtle eeriness persists. A reminder that while history can be taught, its echoes cannot be erased. Salem today is a city of duality. On one hand, it is cheerful, tourist-friendly, a place of commerce and celebration. On the other hand, it is solemn, haunted by its own past, marked by the injustices and fears that once consumed it. Walking through its streets, one cannot ignore the lingering shadows, the whispered warnings, or the heavy silence of places once filled with terror. And perhaps that is the true legacy of Salem. Not only the stories of the accused, the executions, and the hysteria, but the lessons they impart. That fear unchecked becomes a weapon, that accusation without evidence can destroy lives, and that courage, defiance, and moral integrity are remembered long after the world moves on. Salem's streets, buildings, and hills are living reminders. They remind us that the past is never truly gone. The dead may rest, but their stories, their grief, and their courage linger, carried in shadows, whispers, and the wind that sweeps through the town each night. For those who visit or study Salem, the lesson is clear. Remember the past, honor the truth, and be wary of the weight of fear, for it is a burden that can crush even the strongest among us. The story of Salem does not end with the last execution, nor with the last prison door closing. It does not end with the confessions, the apologies, or the attempts at restitution. Salem endures, not only as a city, but as a cautionary tale, a shadow that stretches across centuries, carrying lessons we are still learning today. Giles Corey's defiance, his final words, "more weight," remain etched in history. They are more than the words of a man resisting death. They are a reminder of the enduring power of courage, the cost of standing for truth, and the weight of injustice. Every whispered story of his spirit, every legend of the curse that follows him, is a reflection of the moral weight left behind by hysteria and fear. The lessons of Salem are timeless. Fear can escalate to cruelty. Suspicion can become a weapon. Power can corrupt, even in those who believe themselves righteous. And once hysteria takes hold, Even reason, law, and faith can be twisted into instruments of terror. The villagers of Salem were not monsters. They were human. Their choices reflect what is possible when fear overtakes judgment and when courage is in short supply. Modern Salem, with its bustling streets, museums, and tourism, continues to honor the memory of those lost. Candlelit tours, historical reenactments, and memorials allow visitors to witness, to reflect, and to confront the past. And yet, beneath the surface, the town remains alive with echoes of that dark year. Shadows flicker where no one stands. Whispers drift through abandoned buildings, and the wind carries stories of grief, injustice, and defiance. Those who walk Salem today often speak of chills, of feelings of being watched, or of faint cries carried on the breeze. Some attribute these sensations to imagination, others to the restless spirits of the wronged. But perhaps it is both. The echoes of human cruelty and the memory of courage intertwined, refusing to be silenced. The story of Salem warns us not only about the dangers of hysteria, but about the responsibility of conscience. It challenges us to examine our own fears, to question our assumptions, and to act with integrity even when the world around us succumbs to panic. It reminds us that history is not merely what happened long ago, but what continues to resonate in our lives today. Salem teaches that courage matters, that truth matters, and that the echoes of injustice can reach far beyond their time. The gallows may have disappeared, the prisons may stand empty, yet the lessons remain. And in the wind that sweeps across Gallows Hill, in the shadows of colonial homes, and in the stories whispered by visitors and locals alike, the town continues to speak. To walk through Salem is to walk through history, to confront fear, to witness human frailty, and to glimpse the resilience of those who stood, defiant in the face of unimaginable horror. It is important to remember that while the dead may rest, the stories they leave behind continue to haunt, instruct, and warn. Salem is not just a place, it is a living testament, a story of fear, courage, injustice, and endurance. And as long as its stories are told, the echoes of 1692 will never fade. They will continue to remind us that the weight of fear can crush us, but the courage to stand for truth endures forever.